I recently watched a Paul Elam video and on men and intimacy issues, in which he addressed Bill Cloak, apparently a professor from Southern University of Southern California, who basically told the feminist line that men need to be more like women when it comes to intimacy. And Paul Elam proposed a counter argument in which he wants to say that, well, it's actually the women who are the ones who tend to have intimacy issues. And he defined intimacy as meaning sort of a understanding and acceptance of each other. Now, I found this to be an interesting topic, so I would like to say a few words on the matter. Now, first of all, the definition that Paul Elam gave is rather a subjective one, and it is quite fuzzy and it's difficult to define intimacy in terms of an operational definition. So the approach is to step back and think about the concept of intimacy in terms of evolution and sexual selection. And once we do that, we can also try to observe other mammals in order to make a comparison of how intimacy developed between men and women. We know that intimacy deals with some form of proximity with each other and also a degree of codependency. Intimacy is inevitably developed from these two things, so this desire to be next to each other as close as possible. And in terms of males and females, it's for developing a life together. So we know from evolution that many, if not most mammals, they've developed a more R strategy for survival with respect relative to human beings. And this would entail many offsprings. And generally what happens is the male comes, he copulates with the female, and then he just goes off. And the female is on her own to look after the offspring, which tend to mature much faster before her offsprings can just go on their own too. We know that with human beings, though, with its enlarged brain size, the human baby would need to be born more prematurely. So this means more investment, and in conjunction, we move towards a more K strategy for survival. And this would basically mean that both men and women need to be involved to raise the babies. But still, we still have the reminiscence from our evolutionary past, which means that it is still the tendency that while men are predominantly the pursuers and women are choosers, women are also predominantly the keepers. By this, I mean that she has to find ways to make herself attractive enough in order to keep the guy around, at least in the proximity that she likes. And this would also mean that for the man, that proximity can be negotiated and can be compromised based on other ways in order to make himself competitive and useful. What this means is that for the man, again, proximity can be compromised, and yet for the woman, the proximity in which intimacy develops is the only game in town. And women are naturally selected for intimacy. And as part of the selection for intimacy, the women also develop other strategies such as being more verbally communicative, and she's also more emotionally sensitive. But this doesn't mean that women would have less intimacy issues than men, because as intimacy is her game, intimacy would also become more of a problem for women and less so for men from that magisteria. So really, intimacy is a different thing for men and women, and they fall under different magisteria. Therefore, to compare them, I would argue, is quite ludicrous. To address this point further, let's just entertain for a moment Paul Elam's definition of intimacy and how that varies between men and women. Are men more accepting and tolerant in a relationship with a woman than the other way around? Well, yes, at least most likely that's the case. But the problem is, for a woman, simply being tolerant by itself doesn't mean that you're being intimate with her unless you're also physically there in the proximity that she would like and also being verbally communicative with her. Otherwise, she could very well perceive that man doesn't actually care or is being emotionally distant. And those are the claims that are often used by the feminist. On the other hand, the stereotype that women tend to be the naggers came from the fact that she has to be the primary motivators for change for pretty much anything, because that is her role in a family and in society, to motivate other people, to be the motivating beacon for men in the family and the society in order to take action or to make a change, for good or for ill. Even if she knows her man would perceive her nagging to be making things worse than better. So if she feels that she knows exactly how to make things better, she will nag, which will often perceived by the man to be in fact unempathetic. Now, to give an example of this, my mother is quite a nagger in the family. I mean, both to me and my dad. But she generally cares. In the case of my mother, at least, she generally cares about the both of us, even if her keep doing it many times really makes us feel like shit. But I can tell you that many times, at least for my dad, she in the end helps him eventually solve the issue that sometimes that he's not even aware that he has. So it is very difficult to be able to determine objectively whether the motivation for her to change her man is from her own selfish reasons or more altruistic, and it's for him, or as probably with most cases, both. The one thing that can be certain is that these traits were meant to complement each other between men and women. But unfortunately, they also frequently lead to misunderstandings and toxicity in relationships because human beings are not perfect. So, should men become more intimate like women? Well, from some perspectives, yes, and they already have because the case strategy demands for it, for men to become more verbally communicative, more dependent on women, and sticks around longer in order to raise the costly premature human baby. But as in the reality of today, we're still largely a sexually dimorphic species, so men are never going to just take up the female magisteria for intimacy, and it would be unnatural and foolish for them to try. Just as it would be unnatural and foolish for a woman to attempt the intimacy magisteria for men. In either case, attempting the other's magisteria for intimacy over a certain threshold would drastically diminish the sexual attractiveness of both genders. The woman will be perceived by men as cold and uncaring, and the man will be perceived by women as immature cucks. But the idea ought to be that both men and women recognize each other's qualities and learn from each other, and yet still, finding the desirable balance is difficult. But think of it this way, it is merely one out of many struggles that humanity faced for thousands of years in order to live this life with meaning.